Before we dive into this story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's get into it. Have you ever seen someone who was treated unfairly? Maybe someone who was looked down upon or ignored just because people didn't think they were important? It happens more often than you might think. People sometimes judge others by how they look or by what they think they know about them. But what if the person who was being ignored, the one who was being underestimated, was secretly someone with enough power to change everything? What if that person could turn things around in a big way? Wouldn't that be something? Well, that's exactly what this story is all about. It's about a man, just like you and me, who walked into a car dealership with no special expectations. He wasn't wearing a fancy suit. He didn't have a big entourage following him. He was just another person looking to buy a car. But by the end of the day, everything was about to change. The entire car dealership would be in shock, and the people there would never look at him the same way again. Let me introduce you to Keanu Reeves. But not the Keanu Reeves you think you know from the movies. This is a different side of him, one that no one saw coming. Stick with me, and you'll find out exactly what happens. Imagine this scene. It's a normal day at a car dealership. The sun is shining through the big windows. The floor is clean and shiny. People are talking about cars, checking out different models, and taking test drives. The air smells like new leather and fresh coffee. Everything seems normal. But for one man walking into the dealership, nothing would be normal again. This man, who you might expect to be a regular customer just looking for a car, was someone with a huge surprise up his sleeve. And the surprise wasn't just for the people at the dealership. It was for everyone involved. The story begins with him walking through the door, blending in with the crowd. People saw him as just another customer, nothing special. They were so focused on what they thought he was that they didn't bother to pay attention to who he really was. But Keanu wasn't just another customer. He wasn't someone you should underestimate. Keanu had been walking through life like anyone else, but today was different. Today, he would show everyone at this car dealership just how wrong they were about him. He wasn't someone to be treated badly or looked down upon. No, Keanu had plans. He had a purpose that no one could see yet. But how could they know? How could they possibly guess that this quiet, unassuming man was more than just a regular guy? The answer is simple. They couldn't. And that's what made it so exciting. What happened next was a lesson in not judging others too quickly. It was a reminder that you never really know who someone is until you take the time to get to know them. In this case, Keanu wasn't about to let anyone get away with thinking he was just another customer. He was about to change everything. He walked into the dealership like it was any other day, just looking for a car. But what he was really doing was preparing for something much bigger. And the people who worked there had no idea what was coming. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you were overlooked or treated unfairly? Have you ever been in a situation where people didn't think you were important enough to pay attention to? It's something that happens to a lot of us. But what if you had the power to turn the tables? What if you could change how people saw you just by doing something unexpected? That's exactly what Keanu did. He took control of the situation, and before anyone knew it, everything at that dealership would be different. But it wasn't going to happen the way you might expect. No, Keanu didn't walk in there acting tough or trying to show off. He didn't yell or demand respect. Instead, he did something even smarter. He waited. He watched. And he quietly prepared for the moment when he would reveal who he really was. It's easy to think that someone with power and fame has to act like they own the place. People often expect famous people to make a big show of things. But Keanu wasn't like that. He wasn't there to boast about his success. He wasn't there to tell everyone how important he was. Instead, he chose to remain calm and humble. He let everyone assume he was just another regular guy. And in doing so, he learned everything he needed to know about the people who worked at the dealership. Imagine this. You walk into a store, and everyone ignores you. They don't take you seriously because you don't look like someone who could change anything. But then, you quietly take a step back and let them show you exactly who they are. You watch as they treat you with disrespect, not knowing that you're in control all along. That's exactly what Keanu did. He let the manager treat him badly. He let the employees ignore him. He let them make all the assumptions they wanted. But Keanu was smart. He knew that one day, when the time was right, everything would change. And that day was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. Keanu didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. Instead, he bided his time and waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. And when that moment came, everyone at the dealership would be in for a huge surprise. It's easy to assume that the quiet person in the corner has no power. But sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones who can shake the world up the most. And that's exactly what Keanu was about to do. He was about to show everyone that they had completely underestimated him. So, what happened next? How did Keanu take control of the situation and turn things around? Well, that's where the story really starts to get interesting. Keep reading, and you'll see how this ordinary guy became the most important person in the room. It was a quiet, seemingly ordinary Wednesday morning at Hughes Motor Group. The sun was shining outside, and the big glass windows let in plenty of light. Inside, everything looked just like any other day at a car dealership. People were walking around, looking at cars, talking to salespeople, and test driving the latest models. There was a soft hum in the air as customers asked questions and salespeople made their pitches. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of new leather and shiny metal cars. It seemed like just another regular day. But there was one man who was about to change all of that. He was about to walk into the dealership, and no one would know who he was. He was about to be treated like any other customer, even though he was anything but ordinary. This man was none other than Keanu Reeves. Now, you might know Keanu Reeves from his famous movies. You've probably seen him in The Matrix or John Wick. He's a huge movie star, someone most people would recognize right away. But that's not how Keanu wanted things to be today. No, today he was just a regular guy walking into a car dealership like so many others do every day. Keanu was dressed casually. Nothing flashy, nothing to make him stand out. He wore a simple black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, just like anyone else might wear. His hair was a little messy, and he didn't wear a fancy suit or anything that would make people stop and stare. To most people in the dealership, Keanu was just another customer. No one would look twice at him. He wasn't the kind of person people would recognize right away. He was just another guy looking for a new car, or so they thought. But what they didn't know was that this regular guy was actually someone who had the power to turn their whole world upside down. Engagement hook. Let me ask you something. What do you think would happen if someone famous, like the most famous person you know, just walked into a store and no one knew who they were? Would they be treated differently? Would people be nicer to them or ignore them? How do you think the people in the store would react if they didn't know who this famous person was? Think about it. You might be walking around in a store, not paying much attention to the people around you. But what if one of those people was someone really important? Someone famous? Would you treat them the same as everyone else? Or would you try to get their attention? Let me know in the comments below what you think. As for Keanu, he wasn't there to make a scene or be treated like a celebrity. He didn't want anyone to know who he really was. He wasn't there for the fame. He was there for something else, a new car. Just like many people, Keanu wanted to get a car that would fit his needs. He wasn't looking for anything fancy, and he didn't need the attention. He just needed to buy a car, get in and out, and go on with his day. But when he walked up to the counter, things started to go a little differently than he expected. And that's when the fun began. The man behind the counter, Greg Thompson, looked up from his phone. Greg was the sales manager at Hughes Motor Group. He was used to dealing with all kinds of customers, from people who were just looking for a cheap car to people who had big money and wanted something special. Greg didn't pay much attention to the way people looked. He was more concerned with how much money they were going to spend. But that was about to change. "Can I help you?" Greg asked, looking Keanu over quickly. He didn't recognize him, and he didn't seem to care. To Greg, Keanu was just another customer, and his job was to make a sale. He had no idea that the man standing in front of him was someone very different. Keanu gave a small smile and nodded. "Yeah, I'm just looking for a new car. Something reliable. Not too fancy." Greg shrugged, not really thinking twice about Keanu's request. "All right, well, we've got plenty of options," he said, waving his hand toward the rows of cars. "Take a look around, and let me know if you need help with anything." And just like that, Greg turned away and walked to another part of the showroom, leaving Keanu standing there. Keanu, who had expected a little more attention, was now being treated like just another guy off the street. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. In fact, he seemed to take it all in stride. But little did Greg know, Keanu wasn't just anyone. He wasn't some regular guy looking for a new ride. No, Keanu was far more important than Greg could have ever imagined. Keanu watched quietly as Greg helped other customers. Greg was friendly with the people who looked like they might spend a lot of money. He smiled and joked with them, pointing out features of the cars and asking questions about what they were looking for. But when he looked at Keanu, there was nothing special in his eyes. No interest, no curiosity, just a blank stare, as if Keanu was just another customer who didn't deserve much attention. It was clear to Keanu that Greg had already made up his mind about who he was. In Greg's eyes, Keanu was just another person who probably couldn't afford the cars on the lot. But that didn't bother Keanu. He wasn't there to show off, and he wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. He was simply there to get a car. Keanu wandered around the showroom, looking at different models. He didn't rush, but he also didn't take his time. He wasn't trying to make a big decision. He was just looking for something that would work for him. The more Keanu looked around, the more he realized something important. The people at this dealership weren't paying attention to him at all. And that was exactly what he wanted. Keanu knew something that Greg didn't. Sometimes, the best way to make an impact is to let people think you're just another person. Sometimes, it's not about making a big entrance or demanding attention. Sometimes, it's about sitting back and waiting for the right moment to show people who you really are. And that moment was coming. Keanu was just getting started. As he walked around, Greg continued to help other customers. He gave them his best sales pitch, talking about the best deals and the newest models. He smiled, laughed, and made everyone feel special, except for Keanu. Keanu wasn't the only one who was treated like this. The dealership was full of people who had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. Some of them were already laughing and joking, not knowing that the man they had just ignored was about to make a huge impact. They thought Keanu was just like any other customer. They had no idea that they were about to see something that would change everything. Now, let me ask you again. What would you do if someone famous walked into your store and no one knew who they were? Would you treat them differently? Would you pay more attention to them? Let me know what you think in the comments. And as for Keanu, he was ready. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He was simply biding his time. He was waiting for the right moment to show everyone just who he really was. But for now, he was just another guy blending in with the crowd, just like he wanted. It was a usual day at Hughes Motor Group, with cars lined up in neat rows, their bright paint shining in the morning light. The showroom was alive with activity, customers chatting with salespeople, test driving cars, and walking around inspecting all the shiny new models. The sound of tires rolling across the smooth floor and the smell of new leather in the air created an atmosphere that was exciting for some. But for Keanu Reeves, it felt very different. Keanu walked through the doors of the dealership as if he were just another regular customer, blending in with everyone else. His casual hoodie and jeans didn't scream movie star or famous person. He was just another person in a busy world trying to find a car. But little did the people inside know, they were about to experience a day they would never forget. As Keanu made his way toward the counter, he noticed that the sales manager, Greg Thompson, didn't seem to pay much attention to him at all. Greg was a man with a reputation. He had been working at Hughes Motor Group for many years, and had made a name for himself as someone who knew how to spot the ideal buyer. This buyer was someone who looked wealthy, someone who wore a fancy suit, someone who would walk in ready to drop a lot of money on the best car on the lot. In Greg's mind, that was the type of customer he should focus on, the type of person he should spend time with. Everyone else, well, they were just regular people. And to Greg, Keanu definitely looked like one of the regular people. The moment Keanu stepped forward to approach the counter, he was greeted with a glance, but it wasn't the kind of glance that said, "Oh, here's someone I should pay attention to." It was more like an uninterested look, a quick glance up from Greg's phone, and then right back down. Greg didn't even bother to put his phone down. He didn't seem interested in who Keanu was or why he was there. He simply muttered, "Can I help you?" with a flat tone, as if it was just another day and another customer. He didn't know anything about Keanu, and honestly, he didn't care. Keanu didn't flinch or get upset. He simply smiled, not letting the cold reception get to him. "Just looking for a new car," he said politely, his voice calm. "Something reliable." But Greg wasn't listening carefully. His attention was already on someone else, someone who had just walked in wearing a crisp, expensive suit. To Greg, this man looked like he had money. This was the kind of customer Greg cared about. He quickly turned his head back to Keanu, rolling his eyes ever so slightly, as if Keanu's request wasn't worth much of his time. "Sure, right," Greg muttered under his breath, barely looking up. "Probably just looking for a rental, huh? I don't think we have anything that'll match your budget. But whatever, I guess you can take a look around." Greg didn't even try to hide his condescending tone. He assumed that Keanu wouldn't be able to afford anything in the showroom, so he didn't put much thought into it. Instead, he immediately turned his back and focused on the man in the suit, who had begun to walk closer to the luxury cars. Keanu, however, didn't react to Greg's rude words. He simply stood there for a moment, still calm and composed, taking in the situation. He wasn't upset, but it was clear to him that Greg was judging him based on his appearance. In Greg's eyes, Keanu was just another person who didn't fit the image of someone who could afford a fancy car. And this judgment was exactly the kind of thing that Keanu had learned to handle over the years. Keanu wasn't in a hurry. He didn't care that Greg had brushed him off. In fact, he had expected it. It wasn't the first time he had been treated like this. Sometimes people made assumptions about him because he didn't look like the kind of person they thought should have money. He'd been dealing with this kind of treatment for years, even though he was far from just another guy. As Keanu stood there, waiting to see how things would unfold, he realized that the salespeople in the dealership didn't look at him as someone who might actually be able to make a big purchase. They looked at him the same way they looked at every other person they assumed couldn't afford anything more than a basic car. It wasn't a surprise to him, but it was a little disappointing. As he began to walk through the rows of cars, taking his time, he noticed that Greg had already shifted his focus to someone else. The man in the expensive suit was now standing in front of a shiny sports car, talking excitedly with a different salesperson, who was telling him all about the high-tech features of the vehicle. Greg's attention was completely on him, and Keanu was left to wander through the dealership like an invisible ghost. This wasn't the first time Keanu had been treated this way. It was something he had experienced more than once before, even though he was far more than just a regular guy. But today, Keanu wasn't upset about it. Today, he wasn't here to show off. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was just here to buy a car like anyone else. He wasn't going to let the treatment from the staff change his plans. Keanu moved quietly through the dealership, looking at different models. He wasn't looking for anything too flashy. He didn't need a car to impress anyone. He simply wanted something reliable, something that would serve him well for a long time. But the way the salespeople acted made it clear that they didn't think he deserved their attention. While Keanu walked through the aisles, taking his time, he noticed how the other customers were treated. The rich customers with the expensive suits and the flashy watches got all the attention. The salespeople jumped to help them, eager to show them the most expensive cars on the lot. It was as if those customers had already won some unspoken contest to get the best service. But the rest of the customers, those who didn't look like they could afford a $100,000 sports car, were left to wander around unnoticed. Keanu's calm demeanor didn't change. He wasn't there to be noticed. He wasn't there to make a fuss. He wasn't there to impress anyone. But it was hard to ignore how the treatment of customers seemed so unfair. People were treated differently just because of how they looked. This was the conflict. It wasn't just about buying a car. It was about how people were treated based on assumptions. It was about how one person could walk into a dealership and be immediately ignored, while someone else with a nicer suit was treated like royalty. It was about how appearances mattered more than anything else. And in the middle of this, Keanu was the quiet guy who didn't demand attention. But inside, he knew something that no one else did. He wasn't just another guy. He wasn't just some regular person walking into a dealership to buy a car. There was far more to him than anyone could see. He knew this, and deep down, he also knew that the people treating him like this would soon find out just who he really was. But for now, he just walked quietly through the showroom, taking note of everything, watching how people were being treated, and waiting for the right moment. Little did Greg and the others know, their assumptions about Keanu were about to come crashing down in a way they never expected. Keanu didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to demand attention. He didn't need to show off. He simply needed to wait and let the truth reveal itself when the time was right. And that time, Keanu knew was coming soon. As the days passed, Keanu continued to visit Hugh's motor group, each time walking through the doors with a calm, collected demeanor. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need a flashy car or any kind of show. What he was looking for wasn't something you could see right away. It wasn't a vehicle, and it wasn't about the price tag. He had a plan, and every day, he came back to the dealership, ready to let the world see just how wrong they were about him. Meanwhile, Greg Thompson, the sales manager, continued to treat Keanu the same way. Nothing had changed. Every time Keanu walked in, Greg barely gave him a second look. He was still glued to his phone or talking to more respectable customers. And when Keanu approached the counter, looking for help, Greg's attitude was as dismissive as it had always been. "Looking for something today?" Greg would ask in the same uninterested tone, not even bothering to put his phone down. "We got some good, cheap models over here." Keanu didn't mind. He wasn't there for Greg's approval. He wasn't there to argue or fight. He just smiled politely and nodded, as if everything was fine. "I'm just browsing," he would say, his voice calm and steady. "I'm looking for something reliable." Greg didn't seem to care much about what Keanu was saying. He'd point him toward a few cars that, in Greg's mind, were all that a man like Keanu could afford. "These are the kind of cars we usually sell to people on a budget," he would say, barely glancing at Keanu. "I think they'd work for you." Keanu didn't let this bother him. Every time Greg made another comment about his clothes or how he didn't look like someone who could afford anything good, Keanu simply took note. It was all part of the plan. Why did Greg treat him this way? Keanu couldn't quite figure it out. Was it because of his appearance? Was it because he didn't look like the people Greg usually helped? Maybe it was just how Greg saw the world. In his mind, customers were either important or they weren't, and Keanu didn't seem to fit the image of the important ones. Greg thought that anyone who didn't dress in a fancy suit or have a perfect haircut was simply not worth his time. But Keanu was noticing everything. Every dismissive look, every rude comment, every time Greg took one glance at him, and then turned away without even asking if he could help further. It wasn't just about the cars anymore. It was about the way people treated others, the way they judged a book by its cover and assumed they knew everything without ever bothering to learn more. Keanu had seen this all too many times before. The more he came back, the more he began to understand just how much Greg underestimated him. It was like Greg had a list in his head of what a worthy customer looked like, and Keanu didn't fit any of those expectations. Keanu didn't have the designer clothes or the polished appearance of someone who was going to buy a sports car. To Greg, Keanu was just another person walking through the dealership with no real interest or money to spend. But there was something Greg didn't know. Something that, if he had only paid attention, might have changed everything. Keanu wasn't just another guy. He wasn't here to pick out some cheap, boring car. He wasn't even here for the cars at all anymore. No, by now, Keanu had started to notice something else. The people around him. The way they treated him. The way they treated others. And it bothered him. It bothered him deeply. It wasn't just about buying a car. It was about standing up against the unfair treatment of others, standing up against the way people who didn't fit the right mold were looked down upon. Each day, Keanu walked through the dealership, watching and listening. He didn't speak much, but he was always paying attention. He noticed how Greg treated the important customers, the ones who wore suits and looked like they had a lot of money. He also noticed how Greg dismissed the ones who didn't have the right look. The ones like him. Keanu's eyes were sharp. He was picking up on little things that most people would miss. For example, every time a new customer came in, Greg would give them a once-over and immediately start recommending the most expensive cars, the ones with all the bells and whistles. But when Keanu walked in, Greg barely even looked up. When Keanu asked about a car, Greg would point toward the cheap, basic models in the back, never even considering that maybe Keanu was interested in something better. This constant treatment was like a small puzzle piece that Keanu was slowly putting together. He wasn't just going to walk out of the dealership without saying anything. No, Keanu had a plan, and he was going to see it through. Every time Greg treated him like he was invisible, it only made Keanu more determined to make his point. He would continue to come back, continue to show Greg that he wasn't going to be ignored, no matter how much Greg tried to brush him off. But Keanu didn't just focus on Greg. He paid attention to how others were treated too. He watched how the other salespeople acted toward their customers, how some of them were quick to help and others were too busy to notice the people who didn't look like they could afford a big purchase. It wasn't just Greg's attitude that bothered him. It was the culture of the whole place. The way the dealership seemed to be set up to favor certain customers while ignoring the rest. Keanu's frustration grew each day, but he still didn't let it show. He wasn't going to make a scene. That wasn't his way. Instead, he would simply nod, thank Greg for his help, and leave as if nothing was wrong. But each time he left, his mind was working, thinking, plotting. He knew that the right moment would come soon, and when it did, he would be ready. One day, as Keanu walked through the showroom, something caught his eye. It was a sleek, shiny car in the corner, one of the models that Greg had been pushing toward the high-end customers. The car was gorgeous. It had everything: leather seats, a powerful engine, and the kind of sleek design that made you feel like you were driving a luxury vehicle. Keanu walked up to it and ran his hand gently over the surface. He wasn't interested in the car just for its looks. No, he had seen enough of Greg's behavior to know that this was the kind of car that Greg would never suggest to someone like him. This car was reserved for the important people, the rich, the powerful, the ones who looked like they belonged in the dealership. Keanu could almost hear Greg's voice in his head. That car is out of your league. But Keanu wasn't discouraged. He wasn't here for Greg's approval. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here for something much bigger. The car, as beautiful as it wasn't the point. The point was what Keanu had learned from Greg's treatment. It wasn't about the car. It was about breaking the mold, changing the way people looked at others, and proving that appearances didn't mean anything. Keanu stood there for a moment, lost in thought. He was ready. He was ready to flip the script. The time had come to show Greg and everyone else in the dealership that they had no idea who they were dealing with. What they didn't know was that Keanu wasn't just a regular guy looking for a car. He was someone who had the power to change everything, someone who had the ability to make them all rethink their assumptions. And when the time came, Greg's world would be turned upside down. Keanu wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was patient. And when the time came, he would strike, not with force or anger, but with the truth. The truth that Greg had no idea who he was dealing with. So, Keanu waited. He continued to observe. He continued to let Greg make the same mistakes day after day. Because Keanu knew one thing for sure. His moment was coming. And when it arrived, no one would be able to ignore him anymore. It was another ordinary day at Hughes Motor Group, or so it seemed. The usual hum of activity filled the showroom. Salespeople chatting with customers, the clink of keys as cars were started for test drives, and the familiar buzz of phones ringing in the background. But on this particular day, there was something different in the air. A shift. It was subtle at first, but it grew stronger as Keanu Reeves walked through the door. Today, Keanu wasn't just another guy looking at cars. No, today he walked with purpose. There was an energy about him that made the entire showroom feel different, like something was about to change. The confident way he moved through the space made it clear that he wasn't just there for a casual look around. Something had shifted inside him, and he was ready to take action. He didn't hesitate. His steps were steady, sure, and his eyes scanned the cars with a calm that suggested he was more than just a customer. Keanu knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly why he was there. And this time, he wasn't about to let Greg Thompson treat him like one of the many others who had walked through those doors. As Keanu made his way toward the counter, Greg, who had been talking to another salesperson, didn't notice him at first. But when he looked up and saw Keanu approaching, he greeted him with his usual bored expression, barely looking up from the phone in his hand. "Still browsing, huh?" Greg asked in his usual dismissive tone. "Don't worry, the cheap ones are over there," he added, motioning with his hand toward the corner of the showroom where older cars were parked. To Greg, Keanu was just another guy with no money, another customer who wouldn't buy anything. It was clear he didn't expect anything different. Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he paused for a moment, letting the silence hang between them. His eyes locked with Greg's, and there was something in his gaze, a quiet confidence, that made Greg falter for just a second. Then, with a voice that was calm and steady, Keanu spoke. "I don't think I'll be needing your help today," he said, his words slow and deliberate. Greg blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. He was used to people coming in, asking for cars, and following his suggestions. But Keanu's words felt like a challenge. Greg didn't know what to make of it. "What are you talking about?" Greg asked, still unsure of what was happening. "You want to test drive one of those?" He motioned toward the cheaper cars in the corner, as if that was the only option Keanu could possibly be interested in. Keanu smiled, but this smile was different. It wasn't the forced, awkward smile of someone who had been insulted. No, this smile was one of quiet power. It was the smile of someone who had waited for the right moment, who knew exactly what was going to happen next. "Actually," Keanu said, his voice still calm, but filled with an underlying strength, "I'm here because this dealership, it's mine now." Greg froze. His mind seemed to slow down as his ears struggled to process what Keanu had just said. "What?" His eyes widened slightly, and his brain tried to catch up with the words. Keanu's words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a few seconds. "What do you mean?" Greg stammered, a hint of disbelief creeping into his voice. "Are you joking?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't change his expression. He simply raised an eyebrow, his eyes never leaving Greg's. There was no anger, no bitterness in his tone. There was just a quiet certainty, the kind that makes you believe someone knows exactly what they're talking about. "I bought it yesterday," Keanu said, his words still calm, but this time there was a slight edge to them. "You didn't check your emails?" The words landed with the force of a thunderclap. The air seemed to thicken as Greg stood there, rooted to the spot. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The realization of what Keanu had said began to seep in, and with it came the understanding that his world was about to be completely upended. The man he had been so rude to, the one he had treated like a nobody, wasn't just any ordinary guy. Keanu Reeves was, in fact, the very person who now owned the dealership. The same Keanu Reeves from the movies. The same man whose name was known across the world. The realization hit Greg like a bucket of cold water. Keanu wasn't just a customer. He wasn't just someone with an average income or a casual interest in cars. No, Keanu was the new owner of Hughes Motor Group. The same man Greg had dismissed, ignored, and even mocked. For a moment, Greg didn't know what to do. He had no words. His face turned pale as the shock of the moment set in. How could he have been so blind? How could he have treated someone with so much power and influence with such disrespect? Keanu's calm gaze never wavered. He didn't need to say anything more. The truth was clear. The man who had been treated like a nobody was now the man in charge. Greg finally managed to find his voice, but it was shaky, unsure. You're the owner now?" he asked, the words sounding hollow even to him. Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the showroom, taking in the cars, the employees, the atmosphere of the place. He had a vision for what he wanted Hughes Motor Group to be. He had a plan, and it wasn't about selling cars to the highest bidder. It wasn't about judging people based on their appearance or their bank account. No, Keanu's vision was much bigger than that. He wanted a dealership where everyone was treated fairly, where no one was dismissed simply because they didn't look the part. Keanu turned back to Greg, his eyes never leaving him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't out for revenge. He simply wanted to set the record straight. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Keanu said, his voice still steady. "But I've seen how you've treated people here. How you've looked down on people just because they don't look like they have money. I can't let that slide anymore." Greg swallowed hard, but the words wouldn't come. He was speechless, caught in the realization of his mistake. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his judgment, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. Keanu wasn't just there to buy a car. He was there to teach a lesson in respect, in humility, and in seeing the value in everyone, regardless of what they looked like or how much money they had. As Keanu continued to speak, Greg felt the weight of his own ignorance. He had underestimated the wrong person. He had treated someone with kindness and respect as if they were nothing, and now he was facing the consequences. The silence between them was thick. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, letting Greg process the reality of the situation. The dealership, the very place where Greg had felt so secure in his position, was no longer his to control. Keanu was the one in charge now. For Greg, the realization was overwhelming. He had no idea how to fix this. He had no idea how to undo the damage he had done. And now, there was nothing he could do to change the fact that Keanu Reeves, the man he had dismissed so many times, was the new owner of the dealership. The truth was undeniable, and it left Greg standing there, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and regret filling him. The man who had been treated like nothing was now the one who held all the power. And as Greg stood there, trying to process the situation, he knew that his life was about to change forever. Keanu wasn't here to punish him. He wasn't here to make Greg suffer. But he was here to make sure that no one would ever be treated like Greg had treated him. No one would ever be looked down on again, not under Keanu's watch. As the silence lingered, Keanu finally broke it with a simple statement. I think it's time to show you how things are going to be around here. And with those words, the dealership, its culture, its treatment of customers, its very soul, was about to change. Greg Thompson, who had been so sure of himself, now stood on the edge of a world that had just been flipped upside down. The power had shifted, and Keanu Reeves was the one in control now. The sun had barely risen the following day, but the air at Hughes Motor Group felt charged with a new energy. Something was different. It was the kind of morning that felt like the calm before a storm. The employees shuffled into the dealership, completely unaware of the events that were about to unfold. But Greg Thompson, the sales manager, knew that something wasn't right. He had been called into the office, and that could only mean one thing. Keanu Reeves, the man he had so carelessly disrespected, was finally ready to deal with him. For days, he had been trying to wrap his mind around the shocking revelation from yesterday. He still couldn't believe it. Keanu wasn't just some guy walking in to buy a car. He was the new owner of Hughes Motor Group. The same man he had mocked, ignored, and belittled was now the one with all the power. As Greg walked through the dealership that morning, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own mistakes. The air felt heavier than usual. His steps were slower, unsure. He had spent years climbing the ladder, thinking he was untouchable, thinking that no one could ever challenge his position. But now, the rug had been pulled out from under him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had taken for granted, was about to come crashing down. Greg entered the office with a sense of dread. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. As he stepped inside, he saw Keanu sitting at the desk. The man who had once been a nobody in Greg's eyes was now sitting in the seat of power. Keanu's calm and confident presence made the room feel like it was filled with energy. He wasn't the same man who had walked in the day before, unsure of himself, just another customer. No, today Keanu was in full control. He was the one calling the shots. Keanu didn't need to stand up when Greg walked in. He was already in charge. He didn't need to make a show of power. It was clear from his posture, his eyes, the way he held himself. Keanu was the boss now. Greg, Keanu began, his voice steady and calm, yet filled with authority. I've heard enough about your treatment of customers and employees. It's time for a change. Greg didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, waiting for Keanu to say more, his heart racing. He could feel the tension building in the room. His mind was spinning with the realization that he had no idea what was going to happen next. His chest tightened, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Keanu's gaze never wavered. He wasn't going to let Greg off easy. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about setting things right. It was about restoring dignity and respect where they had been taken away. It was about creating an environment where no one would be treated the way Greg had treated so many people. Keanu paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment before he spoke again. You're fired, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. And I'll make sure everyone knows why. Greg's face turned pale. His legs felt weak, like they were about to give way beneath him. His mind raced as he tried to process what Keanu had just said. Fired? He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He had no idea what to say. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had been the one in charge. He had been the one who made all the decisions. And now, here he was being fired by someone he had treated like a nobody. Keanu's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. It's not just about you, Greg. It's about how you treated everyone else, your coworkers, your customers. No one should feel small because of how they look, how much money they have, or where they come from. That's not how we run things here. The words hit Greg hard. He had always thought of himself as someone in control, someone who could make people bend to his will. He had never once considered how his words and actions might affect those around him. But now, with Keanu's steady gaze upon him, Greg saw the truth of his own behavior, the harm he had caused. As security moved into the room to escort Greg out, Keanu didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded, signaling that it was time for Greg to leave. It was done. There was no turning back. Greg was no longer in charge. He had lost everything, his job, his position, his reputation, all because of his arrogance and disrespect. But this wasn't the end for Keanu. No, he wasn't finished yet. As Greg walked out of the office, his head hanging low in shame, Keanu stood up, his eyes scanning the showroom floor. The employees were still going about their work, unaware of the momentous change that had just taken place. They didn't know yet that the dealership had a new owner. They didn't know that everything was about to be different. Keanu walked to the front of the showroom, where the employees had gathered. His presence silenced the room. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and Keanu didn't waste any time. He knew exactly what needed to be said. "This is a place of respect," Keanu began, his voice strong and commanding, yet filled with sincerity. "From now on, everyone is treated equally. No one gets to decide who's important and who isn't. No one is above anyone else. We're all in this together." The employees stood there, stunned by the words they were hearing. It was as if a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. The atmosphere in the room changed, and they could feel it. Something had shifted. The sense of hierarchy, the feeling that some people were better than others, was gone. Keanu's words rang true, and for the first time, they felt like they were in a place where they mattered, where they were valued. Keanu continued, his voice rising with passion. "We're going to create an environment here where everyone feels welcome. Customers, employees, everyone who walks through these doors will be treated with the same level of respect. And if anyone thinks they can act like they're better than someone else, they'll be out of here just like that." He snapped his fingers for emphasis, making the point clear. The employees looked around at each other, their eyes wide with shock and admiration. Keanu had just set the tone for what was to come. He wasn't going to tolerate the kind of behavior Greg had shown. He wasn't going to let anyone feel small or unimportant. This was going to be a place where everyone was equal, where respect and kindness were the foundation of every interaction. And just like that, things began to change. The next few days were filled with subtle yet powerful transformations. Customers walked into the dealership and were greeted with warmth and genuine interest. No longer were they judged by their clothes, their appearance, or their bank accounts. Everyone, from the wealthiest to the most modest, was treated with the same level of courtesy and respect. The employees, too, began to feel the shift. They worked harder, with more passion and dedication, because they knew that they mattered. They knew that they were part of something bigger than themselves, part of a team that valued their contributions. Keanu had created a workplace where everyone felt empowered, where no one had to fear being judged or belittled. As for Greg, he was left to pick up the pieces of his life. No longer a part of Hugh's Motor Group, he found himself in a difficult situation. His reputation was shattered, and he struggled to find another job. People remembered how he had treated Keanu, how he had looked down on him, and they knew he wasn't someone they wanted to work with. But the truth was, Greg had brought it on himself. Keanu hadn't just fired him because of one mistake. He had fired him because Greg had failed to treat others with dignity and respect. He had treated people like they were nothing, and now he was reaping the consequences of that behavior. Keanu had done what he needed to do. He had made sure that justice was served, that the culture at Hugh's Motor Group would be one of fairness, respect, and equality. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been looked down upon or treated as if they didn't matter. And in doing so, he had made a lasting impact on the dealership, on the employees, and on the community. It was a new day at Hughes Motor Group, and with it came a new era, one where respect was at the heart of everything they did. Keanu stood tall at the front of the dealership, looking out over the showroom floor. There was a calm smile on his face, a sense of peace that only comes when you've done the right thing. It was like the air around him had changed, filled with a sense of triumph and new beginnings. The journey that had started with so much tension, so many misunderstandings, and so much disrespect had come to a full circle. Things were different now. And in that moment, standing there in the place he had worked so hard to change, Keanu realized something important. It wasn't the loudest person who had the most power. It wasn't the person who made the biggest noise, or who had the flashiest clothes, or the strongest words. No. Sometimes it was the quietest person in the room who held the most strength. The one who stayed calm, who watched, who listened, and who saw things for what they really were. The one who knew that true power came from respect, patience, and understanding. Keanu wasn't the loudest or the most demanding person at Hughes Motor Group. He had come in quietly, dressed casually, just like any other customer. No one knew who he was at first. No one had any idea that this quiet man, the one they barely noticed, had the power to change everything. They had underestimated him, and they had done so because of the way he looked, because they thought they knew him based on their own assumptions. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Keanu's story is a reminder to us all. Never judge a book by its cover. Never assume you know someone just by looking at them or hearing a few words. You might think you can figure someone out just by how they walk, talk, or dress, but you can't. People are deeper than that. They are more than just the surface that you see. How many times have we seen someone who seemed normal or unimportant, only to find out later that they were capable of amazing things? How many times have we underestimated someone because they didn't fit the ideal image in our minds, only to be shocked by what they could do? Keanu's story is just one of many reminders that appearances can be deceiving. The person who might seem like they have nothing to offer might actually be the one who changes everything. Keanu had walked into that dealership just like anyone else. He didn't come in with a fancy car or a team of bodyguards. He didn't flash money around or act like a VIP. He just came in quiet and humble, wanted to buy a car. But in doing so, he taught a lesson that would last far longer than any car sale or dealership deal. He showed everyone that respect is more important than status, that kindness and fairness can change the world around you, and that those who are dismissed by others can sometimes be the ones who have the power to make the biggest impact. And when it came time for Keanu to stand up and make things right, he did so with quiet strength. He didn't yell or make a big scene. He didn't get angry or start a fight. He simply showed the truth. He showed what it really meant to treat people with respect. He didn't let Greg or anyone else get away with mistreating others just because they thought they could. Keanu didn't just change the culture of one car dealership. He made a bigger change. He reminded us that true success isn't about how much money you have or how much power you think you hold. Success comes when you treat others well, when you show them kindness, when you don't judge them by how they look or what they wear or where they come from. Success comes when you make the world a better place for everyone, not just for yourself. As Keanu stood at the front of the dealership, his heart filled with pride, not for himself, but for the changes he had made. He had created a place where people would be respected, no matter who they were. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about everyone who walked through those doors. It was about the customers who would no longer be judged based on their clothes or how much money they had. It was about the employees who would now feel valued, like they were part of something important. Keanu knew that in life, respect isn't just something you should expect from others. It's something you have to give. If you want respect, you need to give it first. And that was exactly what he had done. He had respected every person he met, no matter who they were. He had shown kindness and fairness to everyone, and in doing so, he had earned the respect of the people around him. The lesson here is simple. Respect is the foundation of everything. It's the foundation of friendships, of families, of businesses, and of life itself. Without respect, nothing can truly grow. Without respect, nothing can last. When people feel respected, they feel valued. When they feel valued, they work harder, they do better, and they treat others with the same respect they've been given. It's a cycle that makes everything better. Keanu's story is a reminder that sometimes the people who are treated the worst are the ones who can do the most. They are the ones who have the strength to stand up for what's right. They are the ones who can bring about the most positive change. Never underestimate them. They may not be loud or flashy, but they have the power to change the world. So, the next time you meet someone, don't judge them by how they look. Don't assume that because they don't wear expensive clothes or drive fancy cars, they don't have something valuable to offer. You might just be surprised. The person you least expect could be the one who changes everything for the better. Keanu's story didn't just end with the firing of a rude sales manager. It ended with a message that we can all carry with us. Treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. Because sometimes the person you least expect could be the one who ends up changing your life. And so, Keanu stood at the front of the dealership, not just as the owner, but as a symbol of quiet strength, dignity, and respect. He had shown everyone that when you treat people right, when you believe in fairness and kindness, you have the power to change the world. It was a lesson for all of us, one that we can carry with us every day in every part of our lives. Remember, respect is the foundation of success. It's the key to making the world a better place. Don't ever forget it.